Are we good? Because it looks like it's on mine. Okay, hey, let's get started. Sorry for the delay, everybody. But we'll get started right away. First of all, we're in John chapter 18, just in case you're wondering. And now, in the room, at your tables, I would like you, we do have a couple new people. So if you're at a table, I want you to introduce yourselves if you don't know everybody at your table. And after you do that, the discussion question for the evening is, what is the worst injury you have ever experienced? So I'm thinking injury, not disease, not illness, an injury. Like, for example, how I would answer this question is the worst injury I ever had that I can at least think of off the top of my head is when I was 10, I was skiing, and there was a mogul that I did not see, and so my ski went one way, my knee went the other way, and I just pulled some ligaments in my knee, but I can still feel them to this day if I bend my knee just right. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going for, all right? So introduce yourselves. What's the worst injury you've ever experienced? And if you're watching us online, please type in your answer online, all right? And just spend a couple minutes and go. Okay, let's see what kind of damage we've done. Online, let's see here. Let's see what we got online here. We have a torn ACL. We have a fall with a skinned forehead, knee, and some nerve damage. And slipped leaving church in Iceland and pulled a muscle in the back of my leg. Okay, so in the room, let's see what we got in the room here. Someone from this section. What's a good injury we had?
I went through a window when I was left, cut a big chunk of my.
You went through a window and had a big chunk of her arm taken out from that. Now you have a scar. We don't need to see scars. We'll take your word for it. But no, okay, that's a good injury. That's a good injury. What about in the middle of the room here? Any good injuries in the middle of the room? A broken leg.
And these two have collarbones.
And broken collarbones. Okay, that's very impressive. What about this side of the room? Any good injuries over here?
I broke my wrist.
You broke your wrist. Falling off the monkey bars. And how old were you?
7th grade.
7th grade. Okay, that works. Hey, Joe, can I ask you to close that door right there? The middle schoolers are being middle schoolers. Yeah, that's okay. They're supposed to. Oh, someone else had to have a tonsillectomy, so that's okay. That's technically not an accident unless you accidentally did that, which would be interesting. Okay. So, Gospel of John, as I begin and end every week, the reason why John wrote the Gospel is stated in John chapter 20. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The Gospel of John is the most unique gospel, meaning 90% of the Gospel of John is only found in the Gospel of John. Now, John 18, which we're on tonight, is not unique. In fact, a lot of the rest of the gospel will not be unique, although parts of 21 will be, because it deals with Jesus' arrest and his crucifixion and resurrection, which is covered in all the gospels. But at least in John 18, he has there is a unique way that he frames Jesus' arrest. But before we get into that, and before we even get into John 18, the first thing I would like all of you to do is turn to Genesis chapter 3, and you're going to look at the first 6 verses of Genesis chapter 3, and I'm going to want you to simply look at 5 things. Who is in the story? What happens in the story? Where does this story take place? Why, and the why and how are specific to the serpent's actions. Why does the serpent do what he does? And how does the serpent go about doing what the serpent does? Okay? So who, what, where is just for the story in general. And the why and the how are specific to the serpent. Okay? And I wrote them down so you wouldn't have to remember them all, as I've done to you many times in the past. Okay? So at your tables, have someone read these 6 verses, and then just fill in these blanks. Okay? And go. Okay, let's see how we did. Okay. Oh, hold on. There's been a couple times I forget to turn my mic back on. I have my mic on for those of you watching online. You're welcome. Okay. So who is a part of the story? The serpent. And we're going to say that the serpent, now I'm hesitant to call the serpent the devil because in Genesis 3, the serpent is never called the devil. The serpent is called a serpent and is called a wild animal, and it walks and it talks. But because the story says it's a wild animal, I'm hesitant to say that it was Satan. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying I'm hesitant to say that. But I do think it's safe to say that the serpent represents some kind of evil. Okay? I think that's safe. All right? And so who else is in the story? Adam and Eve, the humans. Yes? All right. So that's the who. Now, what, and I could have been more specifics, but you should be able to get this. What happens? What specifically, I'm thinking the people. What do the humans do? And they listen to the serpent and specifically do what? They eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God told them not to do. And if you've ever heard me talk about this, why did they do that? They were deceived. We'll talk about that in a second. It was pleasing to the eye and good for food and desirable for gaining wisdom. Those three things all appeal to our desires. The reason they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was because they wanted to. So what did the humans do? They ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I'm going to simplify it by simply saying, what did they do? They did what they wanted. Now, there is a level of deception. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, where did this take place? Garden. Okay? Garden of Eden. We'll just say garden. Oh, and what was the main plant in the Garden of Eden? I know it's not in chapter 3, but trees. It's a garden full of trees, yes? It's not a garden of grapevines. It's not a garden of corn. It's trees. It's really more of an orchard than it is a garden. Okay? The way that we understand gardens, at least. Okay? Now, why do you think the serpent did what the serpent did? He tricked them, and he tricked them for a reason, right? The serpent had a reason for tricking them. Now, we don't have time to go into what those reasons could be, but I just wanted to point out that the serpent had a plan. Yeah, is that safe? We may not know what the plan was, but this wasn't some random act. The serpent was more crafty than any of the other wild animals. Serpent knew what the serpent was doing. Okay, and how did the serpent do what he did? He talked to them. He convinced them, and how did he convince them? Twisting God's word, and someone said it earlier, there was deception. There was a little bit of trickery going on, yes? All right. Now, what I would like us to do next is I would like you guys, now you can turn to John 18, and using this as a guide, I would like for you to come up with as many parallels in the John 18 verses 1 to 6, John 18 verses 1 to 6, and see if there is some kind of parallel with the answers we just came up with. I am going to give you the first one, as long as the projector works. Maybe. Okay. John, can you go to the light switches real quick? And I think I want you to do the far left one. And then I think try that one. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, he told me to hit the RG, this button, if it were to do this. And Andy, I don't know how well you can get this on the, if not, we'll do the best we can. Yeah, it always says to clean the air filter. One of these days it actually won't work because I haven't cleaned the air filter. But not today.
You need to have Ryan come clean it. I mean, he's tall enough, he could just reach up there. Or Brett. Have Brett do it.
Okay, this is the Garden of Gethsemane. So when it says that Jesus went to pray in the Garden of, now in John it doesn't mention Gethsemane, but just trust me, it talks about the Kidron Valley. Trust me, this is where Jesus was hanging out, okay? Not in this exact spot, but this is the Garden of Gethsemane. And what do you see? This is an olive grove. The Garden of Gethsemane is not a cornfield, or it's not beans, it's not grapevine. It's a garden of trees, just like the Garden of Eden. Gethsemane is an olive press, and it would make sense that you would find a Gethsemane in an olive grove. Okay? So, when you think of Jesus praying in the garden, this is what you should picture.
But that's an ancient. Did it look old like that?
No, I'm sure it did not look old like that. Some of those trees, I don't know if any of these trees is the case, but some of the olive trees that are there today date back close to the time of Jesus. I'm not going to say they date to the time of Jesus, but like that tree on the right, look how thick that trunk is. That's an old olive tree. So, okay? So, one of the parallels is that the story in John chapter 18 takes place in a garden with trees, just like the story in Genesis chapter 3. I would like you to look at now the rest of John 18 verses, what verses I say, 1 to 6, and see how many other parallels you can come up with. John, will you please turn those lights back on for me? Thank you, sir. Yeah, someone should read the passage.
Went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was
Okay, let's see how you did. Let's start with the who. Okay, do you see a parallel between the who in this story and in the John 18? Judas represents evil, even I would argue more so than the serpent does, because it talks about how, in some places Satan enters them and this, all that stuff. So now you have Judas and you have a human, okay, Jesus being the human, okay? Now, the what in the Genesis 3 story is the humans did what they wanted. What does the human, Jesus, do in John 18? Does Jesus do what he wanted? Jesus does what God wants, which, if you go back to the Genesis story, is the exact opposite. Had to make sure I had that turned on. It was the exact opposite of what Adam did. Adam and Eve did what they wanted. Jesus did what God wanted. Okay? Where? We already talked about where. Now, the why. The serpent had a plan. Why did God do to Jesus what he had Jesus do? God had a plan. And that plan was a little deceptive. Because when Satan had Jesus arrested and crucified, he thought he was winning. And when he thought he was winning, he actually was. It was not just any old losing, it was the death blow of losing. God used exactly what Satan wanted to do to accomplish his plan. Just like the serpent used exactly what the humans wanted to do to accomplish his plan. Now, this should, if you've ever taken my Genesis class, some of this is repetitive, because I always like to point out, if the beginning problem was humanity and trees, that was the original problem, well, then the solution should have something to do with humanity and trees. Does this make sense? We rarely connect what happens in the garden with what happens on the cross. And what did the early believers call the cross? You actually see this in Scripture. They said Jesus, they killed him by hanging him on a tree. They didn't hang him on a tree, they hung him on a cross. But the New Testament writers call it a tree to echo back to Genesis 3. Because if the problem started with humans and trees, the problem has to be solved with humans and trees. And about desires and God's word and all that stuff. Okay? All right. Now what I would like you to do is go ahead and read I know you already read verses 1 to 6. Read verses 1 to 14 at your tables. And yeah, I know you already read verses 1 to 6. Read them again. It won't hurt, I promise. So John 18, verses 1 to 14. And what does Jesus, what I want you to focus on is what does Jesus do? Okay? I want you to identify what Jesus does in those 14 verses. What does Jesus know in those 14 verses? And what does Jesus say in those 14 verses? This is not, none of these are trick questions. They should all be fairly straightforward in the text. What does Jesus do? What does Jesus know? What does Jesus say? All right? So read those verses and answer that as best you can, and go.
Judas
Okay, let's see how we did. So, what did Jesus do?
Verse 11,
Okay, what was that?
he drank the cup.
Well, did he drink the cup or did he say he was going to drink the cup?
He did what he was supposed to.
He was supposed to, but I'm talking very literally, like he identified him. Okay, that was not one that I had, but I'm going to go with that. Before he identifies himself, what does he do? He went to the garden. The first thing he did is he went to the garden. Yeah. And just by the way, this is something I have to do all the time, is that because I'm so used to, because I know the story and stuff, I don't read the story. I just start looking for the meaning behind the story. And what's really good about asking a question as simple as, what did Jesus do? You actually have to read the story. Well, he went to the garden. Okay, he went to the garden. And then what else did he do? So after he went to the garden and before he identified himself, what did he do? That's not in the passage. You're limited to the first 14 verses of John chapter. He did pray, but that was John 17, so it doesn't count. What's that? He entered the garden, and when he saw the soldiers coming, before he asked him a question, he went out to them. Now, I don't know this for a fact that this is what happened, but I have been to the Garden of Gethsemane, and you can see from the Garden of Gethsemane, you can see the wall of the old city of Jerusalem. And you can see the outline of where the gate that those soldiers, if they were going to leave the city to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, the gate they most likely would have left is the gate that goes out that wall. And when you're standing, again, this was late at night, and they had torches, right? Because it's not like they had flashlights, or it's not like there were lit streets. If you're going to go walking out of the city at night, you need a way of lighting your... So they had torches. It was a fairly decent-sized group, so it would have made a little bit of commotion. And standing in the Garden of Gethsemane and looking at that gate, you envision, okay, what if about 30 people with torches would have come out this way? Would you have seen them? Immediately. They would not have snuck up on Jesus. Jesus would have saw them coming as soon as they left the city. And so he had plenty of time to escape. And he doesn't escape. He goes out and meets. So they go to the garden, and then when he sees them coming, he goes out and meets them. And then he identifies himself, and he starts having this dialogue with them. Okay? Well, he has a dialogue. That's part of the identifying. All right. Now, what did the passage say that Jesus knew? He knew what was going to happen to him. So he's not surprised to see him coming, and he's not surprised of what's going to happen. Now, what are some things that he says? Yeah, so what did I write down here? Okay, who do you want? And what's the answer? I am he. Now, we're going to talk about this in a little bit because the first time he answers that question, what happens? They all fall to the ground. Did any of you wonder why did they fall to the ground? Yeah, it's kind of weird, right? All right, we'll talk about that in a second. All right, but he says that, he says, who do you want? I am he. That happens twice, right? Okay. Now, then what does he say? What's the next thing he says? Who do you want? I am he. Who do you want? I am he. Let these guys go. Let these men go. Okay? And then what's the next thing he says? Put away your sword. And what's at least the last thing I identified he says? What's the last thing he says? Yep. The Father has given me. Okay, now, before I get into all of this stuff, let me just address two side things. The first is, why do they fall down? It's kind of weird, okay? Now, what you have to know is that when he says, I am he doesn't say, I am he. The he is a nice little English addition to clarify maybe what he meant. He didn't say that. He said, I am. The Greek is ego eimi. I am. There is one other time in the Gospel of John before this that Jesus will say, ego eimi. Does anybody know where in the Gospel of John that might be? Even give me the chapter. Okay, it's okay. God still loves you. John chapter 8. That would have been like really impressive if you would have known that, just for the record. It's John 8:58. John 8:58 says, very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, what is English, teachers? What is wrong with that sentence? No, okay. Let me put it to you this way. If I were to say something similar to my son, hey, look, before you were born, I was, okay? Look, I was going to Disneyland before you were born. So don't tell me what ride we should go on next. Okay? Jesus says, before Abraham was born, that's bad grammar. It's not right. It's ego in me, and I know somebody knows this. Where does this come from? Why did Jesus say I am? That's what God told Moses. Do you know what chapter and book? I'll tell you what, you got the book right. Exodus 3. Everyone turn to Exodus 3. Verse 14. I'll go to verse 13 first. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. So now if you go back to John 8:58, and he says to the Jewish folks, I believe is some of the leaders at least, let me go back and actually look before I just guess. Just says the Jews, doesn't necessarily say the Jewish leaders, but he says to the Jews, before Abraham was born, I am. And at this, they picked up stones to stone him. Why would they do that? Because he just called himself by the same name God did. That's sort of a no-no. You're not supposed to do that. So now go to John 18. And verse 5, he says, I am. and they all fall down. It's the same kind of I am that God said to Moses, and the same I am that Jesus said to the Jews in John chapter 8. It was a statement of his divinity. It was a little bit of a power play. I am. And I don't think he was identifying himself. He was making a statement. Okay? Make sense? Right. So that's why they fell down. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is anybody wondering what's the problem with Peter? Peter, what are you doing? Okay? There's a whole bunch of people here, and you think you're going to do any good by cutting off some guy's ear. Thanks a lot, Peter. Good job. Okay? Now, before I get into Peter, I have one more picture to show you, so let me get into that. John, if you wouldn't mind catching those same two. Oh, Andy's got them for you. Thanks, Andy. And let me get the right picture. Let's see here. Okay, if you're watching online, we're still here. We just went in the dark. It's fine. Okay, while the air filter is cleaning. So, one of the groups of Jewish people that lived in the time of Jesus were called the Zealots. The Zealots believed that God would deliver the Israelites from the Romans through violence. That we needed a violent overthrow of the Romans. Now, before you think, well, that's stupid, okay, why would you think the God of love would deliver you through violence? Is because every time in their history, God delivered them through violence. Think Exodus. What did God do to Egypt with the plagues? What did God do to the army? When they were in the desert, what did he do to the people that came across in the desert? Or when they entered the promised land, how did they take over the promised land? Was that negotiations? No, that was violence. Or the judges. Anytime the judges would deliver them, how did he deliver them? That was through violence. When David conquered people, what did he do? Violence. Even up to, we've talked about them a couple times, the Maccabees. When the Maccabees came, how did they win independence over the Greeks? It was violence. Every time in Israel's history when God delivered them, it was almost always through violence. So the Zealots' way of thinking was not that weird. It's weird to us, but not to them. Now, when the Romans, about 70 years after, well, not 70 years after Jesus, AD 70, the Zealots had an uprising up against the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire decided enough is enough. We are going to send our armies to Israel and take out the Zealots, and actually they take out the whole country, okay? Many of you are familiar with the last of the Zealots hiding out in Masada. Others of you are familiar with the fact that the Romans went to Jerusalem and destroyed that city and its temple in AD 70. Before the Romans did either of those two things, the first place they attacked to destroy the Zealots, to go after the Zealots' stronghold, the first place they attacked was Gamla. Gamla was a city in North Galilee, not far from where Jesus did his ministry. It's highly likely that Jesus went to Gamla, although the scriptures never say that. Scriptures do say that Jesus went to every synagogue in every village in Galilee, which, if you take that literally, would include Gamla, because Gamla was a village in Galilee and had a synagogue. Gamla was the epicenter of zealot thought and practice, and it was their headquarters. Gamla, I don't know if you can see it on the map, is right here. Here's the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus did the majority. Don't do that to me. Oh my goodness, oh, I gotta hit the button again. Oh no, there it is. Okay. This is where, well no, it was my computer went to sleep. So here's Gamla. Okay, here's where Jesus did most of his ministry, right here. Guess where Peter is from? Anybody remember what town Peter's from? Bethsaida. Right there. Here's Gamla. Here's Bethsaida. Do you think that there was any zealot influence in Peter's life? Yes, there was. And the other thing I want you to think about is, now Jesus preached love of enemies. And he preached it in North Galilee. How do you think the zealots like that message? When we hear that message, we have to remember, Jesus saying that, he was risking his life. Okay? You can go ahead and turn the lights back on. Okay. Yeah. Yep, great. So zealots, what they would do is they would kind of do acts of terrorism, because they're not going to, well, we saw what happened when they actually went toe-to-toe with the Roman Empire. They lost. And so what they would do is they would do these little terrorist attacks, like they would sneak up on a Roman soldier in a busy city street, and they would have this little dagger that had a curved edge, so they could go up under his armor from behind and kill him from behind, take the dagger out, and sneak off into the crowd before anyone knew what happened. They also would attack Jews who would, in their mind, would cooperate with the Romans. And let me just try to give you a little bit of what that mindset would be like. About a month ago, people in the United States started dumping vodka on the ground. Now, why did they do that a month ago? Because Russians are bad, right? They're in the Ukraine, and we don't like the Russians. And if you say anything positive about the Russians today, you're a traitor. We're dumping the vodka on the ground. Now, the Russians haven't invaded our country. They've invaded Ukraine, which is a big deal. But my point of saying that is, imagine if the Russians invaded the United States. And then you said something pro-Russian. Or not negative Russian. Okay? Well, the priesthood, the Jewish priesthood, who ran the temple, well, they were called the Sadducees, and they kept their power by working with the Romans. So the Zealots would sometimes target the priesthood. And sometimes they would kill them, or sometimes they would just dismember them. By dismembering them, they would become unclean and would no longer be able to fulfill their priestly duties. So they would cut off a finger or an ear or a nose, and then they couldn't perform their priestly duties. So Peter cuts off an ear of a soldier. Whose ear does he cut off? A servant of the high priest. That is a classic zealot move. That's what Peter is doing. Now, in all of this, getting back, those are two little rabbit trails that took me much longer than I thought because it's already 8 o'clock. Okay, but in all this, what I want you to see here is Jesus, he goes to the garden, he goes out to meet, he sees him coming probably, and he goes out to meet him. He knew what was going to happen. And look what he says. I'm hearing myself. It is not pleasant. Okay. Okay, there we go. I'm okay if you hear me. I just don't want to hear me. All right. And then Jesus goes out and he says, who do you want? Well, that's me. He says, I am. They all fall to the ground. They go through it again. And then look what he does. He says, let these men go. Put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup that my Father told me that I'm going to drink? Who's in control? Jesus is. He's the one being arrested, but he's the one calling all the shots. Yes, you can arrest me. Go ahead and pick yourselves up. It's fine. I'm not going anywhere. Okay, Peter, put your sword down. You do this, you do that. He's in complete control. So even though the soldiers and Judas and the ones who come to arrest him, they have all the power, they do not have the control. They do arrest Jesus because Jesus lets them. But the ones with the power are not the ones in control. And we're going to revisit this theme a couple more times here in the next 15 minutes. Now, what I'm going to do to save some time is I just want to point out, I'm going to read the Peter denying Jesus passages. It's verses 15 to 18 and 25 to 27. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus, and because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known by the high priest, or to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. Now, why would she ask him that? Well, no, what does the text say? Who got him in? Another disciple. So why would she think he's a disciple? Because he's with one of the other disciples. Okay? And he replied, I am not. Now, I just would like to point out that every time Peter says, I am not, it's ego, eimi, with the not. It's the same thing Jesus says, except he says, I am not, I am not, I am not. Okay? Which I'm sure is done to contrast. Now, going down to verse 25, meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there warming himself. So they asked him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? And again, why would they ask him that? Well, what are you doing here? It would make sense. Why are you here? And he says, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. I'm pretty sure that was you. You look awfully familiar to me. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? And again Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow. My point is it was pretty obvious that Peter was a disciple. And again, he was just lying. It's sort of like when you catch someone on video committing a robbery, and you talk to lawyers, they'll tell you this happens. Isn't that you in the video? That looks like you in the video. Yeah, that looks like you. And you own a car like that. Yeah, that's you. No, not me. That's not, but it looks just like me. And I own clothes just like that. But it's not you. And you were there that night? Yeah, I was there that night. But that's not you. No, it's not me. That's kind of what Peter was doing. I am not. Okay, so Jesus has been arrested. His closest disciple denies him. Okay, I'm going to have to do this part too. Let's go to verses 19 to 24. And I just want you to... There's something ironic going on in these verses. And what Jesus is saying, what Jesus is about to say, he is saying at a secret meeting in the middle of the night. So the father-in-law of the high priest has Jesus, and Caiaphas is all in the middle of this too. And it's this secret meeting in the middle of the night. And it's just kind of ironic what Jesus says. Verse 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Unlike what's happening here right now, okay? Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what was wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why do you strike me? And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So it's just really ironic that Jesus says at a secret meeting, I have said nothing in secret, unlike this meeting. He gets slapped in the face for it, and he says, if I've said something wrong, tell me what I've said wrong. Why did he get slapped in the face? Because he told the truth. When you tell the truth, you get slapped in the face. I think we can all relate to that. Okay. Now, so Jesus has been arrested. He's been denied by his closest disciple. He's been slapped in the face. And yet he keeps his cool. He retains complete control over himself and the situation. Now, what I'd like you to do in groups, and Andy, I didn't bold this in my notes either. It's the read verses 28 to 40, and note the ways that Pilate tries to avoid condemning Jesus. Because it sure seems like Pilate is bending over backwards to not condemn him. So just note how many different ways he does that. So read those verses 28 to 40 and note the ways that Pilate tries to avoid condemning Jesus, okay? And go. Okay, because I'm low on time, what'd you guys find out? What ways does Pilate avoid condemning Jesus? Can you name some verses? Can you highlight a verse or two or three or four?
Well, before that, his wife told him, don't mess with this man.
Yes, yes. Paul points out that before this, Pilate's wife has a dream about this and tells Pilate to have nothing to do with this man. That is not in this gospel. But again, that points out there's a reason why that's included in one gospel and not another, because the gospel writer has an agenda. And so John's agenda was different, and so he didn't include that part of the story. But what are some ways, what are some things that Pilate says that gives you the sense he really doesn't want to condemn Jesus? Verse what? 30. Verse 30. I'll read verses 29 through 31. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, he replied, we would not have handed him over to you. And Pilate asked, well, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Well, that doesn't sound like he's very excited about taking this on, right? He says, what are the charges? What do you got against this guy? Well, what do they answer? Yeah, he's a criminal. We're telling you he's a criminal. They don't answer the question. They just say he's a criminal. We wouldn't bring him to you if he wasn't a criminal. Okay. That's a good play. So he says, judge him by your own law. He tries to avoid it there. Are there other places that you see Pilate trying to get out of this? Verse 35. Go ahead. I'll read it. Am I a Jew? Pilate replied. Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done? What is it you have done? Why does this matter? And Jesus could very easily say, I didn't do anything. And it's almost like that's what Pilate is asking. Have you done anything? Okay, and there's another one. What's that? 38 and 39. What is truth? Pilate retorts. With this, he went out again to the Jews, gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom, so he says, there's no reason to charge him, but hey, I'll tell you what. It is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? So Pilate says, hey, look, there's nothing against this guy, so why don't we just make him the one I release to you as part of this custom? It's harmless. Now, Pilate is the governor. He's been put there by the Romans. He has Roman army to command. He is the one in power, right? He's got all the power. And the guy in power does not find a reason to charge Jesus. So, you would think that the guy in power by the Romans with the army, if he thinks we got nothing on this guy, what should happen then? Let him go. That doesn't happen. Because he's really not in control. He's the one with the power, but he is not in control. It's Passover. There are lots of people in town, tens of thousands more than normal. There's a lot of passion going on. Remember what the Passover celebrates? The exodus from the Egyptians, where the people ruling over us get theirs. Okay? He's trying to avoid any kind of riot. So he gives in. And verse 32 says, this took place to fulfill. Now the irony is he releases Barabbas. Now I heard some of you say that Barabbas was a robber. Your text says that. Does anyone have a different translation of what it says about him? Yes. He was a revolutionary. That is probably a better translation than robber. The newest version of the NIV says Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. There's a really good chance Barabbas was a zealot. And he got caught. And that's the irony, is that they accused Jesus of trying to overthrow Rome, and they demand a guy is released who literally tried to overthrow Rome. And even going on, continuing this theme of the one in power aren't the ones in control. Well, even the Jewish leaders at the beginning of this passage, what don't they do at the very beginning? The Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace. It was early morning, and what did they not do? They would not go in the palace. They don't want to be unclean for the Passover. So even though they have all the power, they are really not in control either. So, a couple lessons here as we conclude. First lesson, those who have the power are not necessarily the ones in control. Presidents, Congress, Supreme Court, governors, mayors, they are the ones in power. They have the power. They are not the ones in control. And what's different about us versus what's different about what we're reading in John chapter 18 is we get to participate in the political process. Politics is all about power. Now, that's not all bad. I'm not saying that's all bad. But the political process is the process for determining power. And so as believers in a country that we get to participate in the political process, let us not forget that we are not voting in the ones who control things. We are voting in the ones who get the power. That's not the same thing. There's only one who controls things. So when the people who are in power that we do not like, don't lose too much sleep over it. And when the people who are in power that we do like, don't get overexcited about it. Those are not the ones in control. I'm not saying don't participate in the political process. I'm just saying don't put all your eggs in that basket, because the ones with the power are not the ones in control. There's only one in control. Second lesson, Jesus has been arrested. Jesus' closest disciple denies him. Pilate wants to free Jesus and has the power to free him, but he doesn't free him. It's a huge act of injustice. Everything is falling apart around Jesus. And Jesus is calm because he knows who's in control. He knows it's going according to plan. And I think that's a real good reminder as followers of Jesus, when everything seems to be falling apart around us, what should our response be? Calm. We need to quit freaking out, okay? And I'm not saying that there aren't things that shouldn't be cause of concern. When I say things are falling apart, things are, for Jesus, they were falling apart. And there are things that you may say, yeah, things are really falling apart for us. That is probably true. Don't freak out. Calm. And why should we be calm in the chaos? Because we know who's in control. So don't compromise your principles, don't compromise your morals, don't compromise any of that stuff. But my goodness, I just feel like as Christians in America the last 20 years, we've freaked out a lot. And I'm not saying that things that are happening are all good. I'm just saying, even when things fall apart, if we're going to be like Jesus, we remain calm and we remember who's in control. Because things are going to fall apart. If not in the country, in our own lives. Right? Things fall apart. It's going to be okay. Not fun. It's going to be okay. He has a plan. It's like he has a plan. So, And it doesn't matter who's in power. God's plan is God's plan. Okay. And just as for the record, the people that John's writing this to had no power. And things were completely falling apart. They were hated. You think we're hated now? Pfft, got nothing on the Christians in Rome. They were hated. But John writes this story in John 18 so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Please pray with me. And Lord, again, I would ask that you would encourage each of us, that for some of us, things are falling apart because of health things or job things or economic things or Lord, even the discouragement we experience from things that we see happening politically in our country. But Lord, I would ask that you would remind us and encourage us that we are followers of Jesus and that we know ultimately who's in control and that you work out all things for our good. And so, Lord, I would ask that you would just help us continue to be a blessing to both our friends and our enemies. And it's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Have a great night, everyone. We will see you next week.